So Deuteronomy 31, and this is going to be our last sermon for this season from the book of Deuteronomy. And if you remember, we started reading Deuteronomy together all the way back on April 3rd, so almost 3 whole months ago. And as we opened the pages of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, we asked a very simple question together. How many of you can think of at least one area of your life that could improve? And I remember then, just about everyone raised his or her hand, and just like now, there was some confusion about Bible carts and who needed a Bible and who just thought something in their life could improve. But the question still remains. And Deuteronomy reminds us that as God is improving the situation of his people, moving them out of slavery, giving them the law, bringing them there to the brink of the promised land, and then moving them into the land of promise, God is upgrading their lives in many ways. But along with that improvement comes change. They're going to have to cross some boundaries. They're going to have to embrace some transitions. And as we saw with Deuteronomy, it's a book written to help God's people navigate change as they move toward God's best for them. And in the life of Israel, through their history, of course, it speaks to the situation of the people on the verge of the promised land, about to cross the Jordan. But also, we see in 2 Kings chapter 23, King Josiah of the southern kingdom reads this book after rediscovering it, and it triggers a whole world of improvements and changes in the life of that people. And those changes, actually, for a people who had grown complacent in the land, awakened them kind of out of their complacency. And then finally, it's been a book in Deuteronomy that has helped the people of Israel in their time of exile. And they look back on their life saying, what happened? Why did we lose the land? And Deuteronomy gives insight and wisdom. So as we've seen, reading the book of Deuteronomy, whether you're in a place of looking to take new territory, or you're in a place of complacency, needing to wake up and be revived, or you're in a place looking back and feeling like you've lost something, Deuteronomy gives us God's wisdom and his words to help navigate that change. Now, Deuteronomy 31 drives that point home so clearly, because it puts a massive change in front of the people of Israel. Check this out, 31 verse 1. It says, Moses continued to speak these words to all Israel, and he said to them, I am 120 years old today. Happy birthday, Moses. I am no longer able to go out and come in. The Lord has said to me, you shall not go over this Jordan. The Lord your God himself will go over before you. He will destroy these nations before you so that you shall dispossess them. And Joshua will go over at your head as the Lord has spoken. And the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, into their land when he destroyed them. And the Lord will give them over to you, and you shall do to them according to the whole commandment that I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. And now Moses continues with the plans for the transition. Verse 9, then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, little ones, and the sojourners within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, as long as you live in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. Now, if I were just an average guy in and among the tribes of the people of Israel, let's just say I was a Reubenite from the tribe of Reuben, and I heard this speech from Moses, I don't think I would have grasped much after verse 2. Because Moses delivers some deeply disturbing news. He's not going into the promised land. His time is up. God says, you're not going to cross this Jordan. Do you ever have those moments in conversation where people tell you something and it's so staggeringly significant that everything afterwards you just kind of tune out because you're still reeling from the big statement? What? Moses is not going across the Jordan? I mean, just think about this for a moment. Moses has been their deliverer, their guide through the desert, their leader, their primary judge, their pastor, their general in battle, their manna man when they need bread in the wilderness, their waterman when they need drink in the wilderness. I mean, it is impossible to overstate the significance of Moses' leading presence with this people. And now, just when they're about to go face bigger battles than ever, in a new land, and have to do all sorts of transitions, going from wanderers to farmers, from slaves to free people, from vagrant movers through to settled, established society. All these changes, Moses says, I'm not going with you. If I were an average Reubenite, or Gadite, or Ephraimite, or Benjamite, or Levite, I would have heard that, and I would have thought, what? How in the world are we going to get through this? You could hardly present this people with a bigger change than a change of leadership at this point in their history. This is massive. And so all week long, I've been thinking about my own posture and thought toward change. I mean, some of us love change. Some of us don't like change at all. Some of us like good changes and dislike bad changes. But change, actually, as I've reflected on the last 10 or 15 years of my life, change has been pretty consistent. I mean, in my personal life, got married, that's a big change. Got a house, big change. Got a dog, big change. Had a baby, biggest change you could possibly imagine. I mean, just so many things through the years just keep on changing. And then I started thinking about my time here at Grace as well, and all the transitions, even as Danny is talking about planting churches and the stuff that has happened through Grace in the last few years. I mean, it's all wonderful stuff, but these are big changes. Matt Reynolds going down to pastor at Midtown. Matt and Marge, some of our closest friends, they're mostly anchored in the city now. And a little more than 3 years ago, Buddy nearly dying from his aortic dissection. He planted this church. I lived in his basement all those years. And then all of a sudden there's this transition and I'm pastoring here. And Buddy goes out to New Hope. And then we sent out Randy at the beginning of this year to lead. He'd been our pastor of students here at Snellville for years and years. And now he's leading Grace New Hope, which means that we're working with Benton to step into that role, a pastor of students. And boy, I listened to his sermon from last week. He did such a good job. I mean, he preached so well. I was enjoying it, listening to it. And yeah, he did such a good job. I'm gonna have to watch my back. And so just watching Benton mature as a leader and all these other young leaders around. And just I've been thinking about all these things. astounded how much change in the last 10 or 15 years. And then I started thinking about my response. What first came to mind when I imagined myself hearing this news that Moses would not be going with the people into the promised land if I were an Israelite, how are we going to get through this? And I realized, for me, this is just how I think. I often look at change as something merely to get through. I just think about, well, we'll just get to the other side. We'll get to that place of stability beyond the change. And I was talking to Jim Brown, one of the men who were voting to affirm for the elder board here at Snellville this morning, actually. And Jim has been a longtime friend and mentor and part of Grace, longer than I've been at Grace, just a godly man. And he just recently celebrated his 81st birthday, which makes him an elder in every sense of the word. And I was talking to Jim, and we were talking about a couple things at Grace and some of the transitions that we're working through. And I said, okay, but if we can just kind of get past it. And he kind of smiled at me. And he goes, John, you know, change is constant. And I didn't really want to hear that. I wanted to maintain the fantasy that at some point we'll get to a place in life where all the change is behind us and we can just sort of settle in. But the more I've thought about it, the more I prayed about it, and even reading this passage, I'm so reminded. Part of being a living human being is living with and through and in change, and change is constant. In fact, that's the first blank on your sheets. So here the people of Israel, they're hearing about a massive change. And it raises this massive question, not only for them, but also for us. How do we, as God's people, navigate change? And whether it's the world around us changing, and it seems like the pace of change in the world around us is staggering. A few weeks ago, Amy and I were in North Georgia. We went into a grocery store. You know what they had in there? A video rental area. Like a desk and shelves and videos. Do you remember this? Like years ago, that was such a big deal. Let's go to the Blockbuster on Friday night and rent a video. If they didn't have the video that you wanted, then you were like consigned to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, trying to find something you haven't seen before that's also good, which is kind of impossible to do. And so we walked in, and it was such like a blast from the past. Wow, people still come out and just rent movies. I thought you just push the button and on demand, there it is, or whatever. And I mean, it's a big change. Or what about the internet? I am just barely old enough to remember when there was no internet. Do you remember that? Like, there was a time, people, before you could get the answer to every question in under a second. At the touch of a fingertip, you know? Like there was a time before email, and now it's just become such a part of our lives. It's crazy. And so it's just, I've been thinking about whether it's getting online or my waistline or my hairline. I mean, things are changing. That was like the one sentence from my notes that I remembered. This morning, as I was frantically scribbling in the few minutes before the service started, I was like, there's something about lines in there. Oh, yeah. That was it. Right? So we're living with constant change. How do we navigate it? This is part of being human, and not all of us like it. And often, even if you're a person who likes change, we confront changes and transitions that we don't prefer to go through. What do we need to know about change to move forward? Deuteronomy. Even though it seems like a book written in stone, based on these 10 commandments that we've been studying the last few months, in fact, gives us words to guide us through change. And the first thing that we have to recognize, we see it here, the rest of Deuteronomy 31 and even throughout the whole book, is that change creates challenge. We just got to be honest about that. No matter what, change is constantly creating challenge. Listen to how it plays out for the people of Israel. Verse 16 of chapter 31. The Lord said to Moses, "Behold, You are about to lie down with your fathers, and then this people will rise and whore after the foreign gods among them in the land that they are entering. They'll be unfaithful toward these other foreign gods, and they will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them. And then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them and hide my face from them, and they will be devoured. And many evils and troubles will come upon them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil that they have done, because they have turned to other gods. This is a massive challenge. This is God saying that this people, when they're confronted with the new situation, all the changes that will come with entering the promised land and winning the victories and settling in and beginning to farm, when they're confronted with that situation, they are going to face a significant challenge to continue trusting God and remaining obedient to Him. And in fact, that's the purpose of these laws we've been studying. These 10 commands, these 10 words that really form the backbone of the book of Deuteronomy, they are sort of like the handholds to hold fast to God through change. I'm not much of a rock climber. In fact, I'm poorly built for rock climbing. I'm very heavy, and the idea of sustaining most of my weight with these two knuckles of these fingers is just not feasible for long periods of time for me. But I remember after I graduated from college, I had a buddy who was a big rock climber. He was whip thin and just scampered up these rocks. And we drove out west and we did some climbing, and it was really pretty fun when I was belaying. It was horrible when I was climbing. It was great when I was holding the rope and encouraging him. But one of the things that you learn rock climbing is how important it is to find the right holds, right? The ones that you can really grip onto, the ones that sustain your weight. And it's almost like the 10 commands and all the other explanatory laws around the 10 commands function as those holds. It's like God is laying out very clearly for His people that they're going to be facing a lot of challenges. It's an uphill battle. They're scaling a pretty significant mountain. And these are the things you need to really hold on to. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. The Lord is one. Remember that first command, the undivided God, commanding us to live in undivided love that leads to His undivided freedom. He says, no images. Don't make any images of false gods or idols. Remove the cues that trigger habits of slavery, and instead establish cues and rewards that establish freedom habits. That third command, don't bear God's name in vain. Just as we should not attach anything earthly to God, likewise, don't attach God to something that doesn't reflect His heart. Bear His name as His people in a way that reflects His character. These are handholds. These are the things that will support and sustain your weight through the change and through the challenge that change brings. Keep the Sabbath because you're not slaves. Honor your father and mother that may go well with you in the land. Learn to build those relationships over which and through which things of true value can pass. Do not kill. A difficult command to understand in light of the coming conquest. But as we saw reading through those passages, especially in Deuteronomy 20, we have to understand that command while we look through the crucifixion of Jesus first. That glimpse of the tree gives us clarity about the picture that God's painting. Commands 7, 8, and 9, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, laying out, rounding out this sort of Deuteronomic dream of what society could be like, not in a selfishly motivated, driven, and acquiring way, but in a just way in which all people and all neighbors and foreigners and orphans and widows and the weak and the rich and everyone can live together in true generous community. And then finally, the 10th command, don't covet, almost like a reward. If you learn to love God and be satisfied of soul in Him, then you live a life that is not driven to constantly get this thing and that thing and that thing and that thing. You actually live a life of a satisfied soul. These are the commands. These are the things that are then elaborated in the rest of Deuteronomy. These are the handholds and the footholds that through change help us move. And yet here, what we see in 31, what we just read, is God saying, no matter how hard you want to grip these handholds, at some point your strength will fail. Your grip is not enough. And for some climbers, that moment happens later in life or at the top of the climb. For me, it usually happened about 3 feet off the ground. I'm tired. Can't do it anymore. Part of the challenge of change is that we don't have the strength on our own to hold on to the anchor points, to the holds that we need to. And this is difficult. What do we do with that reality? Verse 19, God tells Moses, therefore, because you don't have the grip strength, because your people are going to fall away, write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. When their grip fails, they need to remember this song, because this song will show them the way forward and give them understanding even amidst the challenges of change. We'll skip forward to chapter 32, where we find this song, the Song of Moses. Beautiful song, challenging song, the lyrical quality and the vocabulary and everything else. The original Hebrew, commentators say, is just fascinating and everything else, but there's something here that I think we really need to grab onto to get deeper into these questions about change. So starting in 32, verse 1, here's where the poem starts. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. And let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew. Like gentle rain upon the tender grass and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your father who created you, who made you and established you? So here in these first opening lines, we see that along with challenge, change also brings a choice. Always. There's always a choice when it comes to change. Sometimes you feel like you're caught up in circumstances outside of yourself, beyond your power and capacity. You feel like you have no choice. No, there's always a choice in change. And here's the choice. Verse 4 talks about the rock, God himself. In my translation, that R is capitalized to make sure you know this is talking about Yahweh, the one who speaks from the midst of the fire, the transcendent creator, one and only God. The rock, his work is perfect. But then the people are described not as steadfast, solid, and secure, but as fickle, blemished, rebellious, foolish, and senseless. So here is the great comparison. There's God the rock, and then this fickle people. And the choice constantly before us in change is the choice of who will be our rock. Will we learn to trust God as our rock, or will we put our faith and our trust into some other lesser rock, right? This is the central choice. As the poem goes on, it affirms that God is a really good rock. Look at verse 10. God found him, speaking of Israel, this people, found him in a desert land and in the howling wastes of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. I remember hearing that when I was younger, and I was really confused. The apple of his eye, like apples are out here, eyes are in here. What is it talking about? Strange fruit imagery. I never really got it. But actually in the original, like the Hebrew language, literally it reads, kept him as the little man in his eye. Which at first isn't much help. You're like, okay, we went from an apple to a little man. Still doesn't make much sense. But when you think about it, here's the image the poetry is trying to convey. Have you ever been so close to someone that you can see your own reflection in his or her eye? You can see the little man, your own reflection in someone else's eye? That's the idea here. That God has encircled and cared and kept and come so close to Israel that he can see his own reflection in his eye. Verse 11, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. Amazing imagery here from the life of the birds of prey, the eagle, right? And if you know much about eagle ways, apparently they have their very high nests, far above what most people could raid or plunder or anything like that. And as the eaglets, the little baby chick eagles, begin to get to the age where they're going to begin to fly, the parent eagle, the mother eagle, will sort of nudge that eagle off the edge of the cliff out of the nest and watch the bird kind of flutter and learn to fly. But the mother's always there, swooping down. And just before the eaglet hits the ground in a splash of feathers, the mother swoops under, catches that eaglet, carries it back up, puts it in the nest to stir it up again and catch it, guide it and carry it so that the little eagle can learn to fly on its own. I haven't quite worked out how that works with human parenting. Bethany's learning to walk, but there's just not much time when you're on the ground between falling over and hitting the ground, so we're working that out. But here it says God is like an eagle stirring up the nest, guiding Israel, teaching Israel to fly. How beautiful is that? And incidentally, this is something that's very interesting. The eagle, back in Deuteronomy 14, is considered an unclean bird, and yet here, God is compared to an eagle. Do with that what you will. Verse 13, he made him ride on the high places of the land. He ate the produce of the field. He suckled him with honey out of the rock and oil out of the flinty rock. God brought sweetness and wealth out of places that seemed so desolate they could never produce. Curds from the herd and milk from the flock with fat of lambs, rams of Bashan and goats with the very finest of the wheat, and you drank foaming wine made from the blood of the grape. It's beautiful poetry about how God has provided luxuriously for his people. He is a good rock, but Jeshurun, which is a sort of a nickname for Israel. Jeshurun, Israel grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. And here the poem actually turns in a darker direction because as they forsake God, God says, I'm bringing judgment. And the judgment is harsh. And here it says God will raise up a nation, the name of which is not known. It's a no nation, just nobody basically. And this nation will come in and wipe out Israel. And then lest this no-name nation feel that it has conquered God himself, God will also bring judgment on that nation. And so this disobedience and the forsaking of God, the rock, results in all sorts of terrible things. But just when it feels or seems or looks like all hope is lost, that God's people will be wiped off the map, extinguished forever because their disobedience is so grave, we get to verse 35. It says, vengeance is mine. That's the Lord. Paul would quote that later in Romans. Vengeance is mine and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip. For the day of their calamity is at hand and their doom comes swiftly. For the Lord, this is where the poem turns, will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. And then he will say, where are their gods? The rock, lowercase r, in which they took refuge. Such an interesting moment in this poem. When will God vindicate his people? when he sees that their power is gone. When they finally recognize that their own strength, their own plans, their own capacity, their own might, their human ambition, their human ingenuity, their human strength is exhausted. It's like God says this people has to hit rock bottom before they will ever be able to recognize the true rock. What do we need to know in change? Well, there's a lot of challenges. And we need to know that our grip strength, no matter how well we can see the holds, our grip strength will fail. In fact, at a certain point, our own strength, our own power is just gone. Whether that comes by judgment or simple, humble, preemptive confession. The vindication comes when we turn to God, our rock, and recognize that he is the whole point of the climb in the first place. It's not the handholds or the footholds. It's the rock himself. And it's choosing the rock as our secure foundation. Let the rock be your stability. Not where you're headed or what will happen on the other side of this change or whatever else, but through the change of life that is constant and constantly challenging, learning to rest on the rock who is God. Not some other little lowercase r rock, not some relationship over here or some bank account over there or some figment of our imagination, future plan over here, but no, learning to rest in the rock, in the humility of knowing that we ourselves can't control the situation. I think that whole issue of control is so significant when it comes to our resistance to change. One of the reasons we don't love change is because it's hard for us to predict its outcomes. It's hard for us to know exactly how to control what will happen on the other side of that change. And here in the heart of this poem, the moment of vindication, God's redemption and salvation occurs when he recognizes that his people finally say, our might and our power is gone. All we have left is to rely on the rock. How do you do that? Big question. Moses in his life is a wonderful example. Moses wrote Psalm 90, we believe. That's the little speaker tag if you go to Psalm 90. And the very first line of Psalm 90, Moses' words, and it seems like when you read the Psalm, it seems like Moses is sort of reflecting on the end of his life back to all the things God has done. Moses says this, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Or in other translations it says, you have been our dwelling place in all of our days. Now just think for a moment about Moses' life and all the change that happened in Moses' life. He's born to a family who are slaves in Egypt. And at the time of his birth, there was a decree out that every male Hebrew birth would need to be killed. Every boy who was born to the Hebrews had to be killed. And so rather than surrender their son to massacre, Moses' parents put him into a little reed raft and set him adrift in the Nile River. That's a pretty intimidating dwelling place. That's pretty out of control if you're Moses. And yet Moses looks back even in that moment and says, God, you were my dwelling place. Well, you might remember the story. One of the women from Pharaoh's household, the king, the palace, sees this little child in the reed raft and pulls him up, adopts him, raises him in the palace. And so Moses is growing up as a young man with all the best training and resources and education. He lives in this massive place of pillars and stone and beauty. And at that point, it would have been easy for Moses to say, wow, this has worked out pretty well. Look at my dwelling place. And yet he looks back at the end of his life and says, even then, God, you were my dwelling place. As a young man, Moses is incensed. He's angered and enraged when he sees one of the Egyptian slave masters brutalizing some of his own people. And so in his anger, he murders that slave master. Then he's terrified, so he flees off into the far end of the wilderness, the backside of the desert. And for 40 years, he raises his family as an anonymous shepherd. In those times, he could have said, wow, God really left me here. But look at what he says in Psalm 90. You have been our dwelling place. You've been my dwelling place all of my days. Burning bush encounter, God sends him back to Egypt. He delivers the people, signs, wonders, out into the wilderness. For 40 years, they're wandering in the wilderness. Once again, it could seem like they're just on an endless death march, and yet Moses looks in that moment too. From change to change to change to change, from circumstance, wealth, poverty, slavery, anonymity, leadership, and every one of those, he looks back and he says, Lord, you've been my dwelling place. It's not my circumstances that are changing constantly and dramatically. It's you who is my dwelling place. And even to the end, it's Moses' confidence and trust in the living God that he has known so well all of his life that enables him in chapter 33 to speak blessings at the end of his life. All of chapter 33 is Moses just speaking blessings over each of the tribes by name. It would have been easy for a man like Moses to be bitter. Yeah, I did all this work. God led this grumbling people for 40 years, and you're not even gonna let me set foot in the promised land. I'm still pretty strong. You could let me in. You could end your life if you were Moses in cursing. But he knows God is rock. And so the words that come from his mouth are blessing. We even get now to the very end of his life in chapter 34, just to finish out the book of Deuteronomy. He goes up the mountain. Nebo looks across the Jordan River into the promised land, though he will never set foot there in this lifetime. Verse 5 says, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants, to all his land, for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. I love this. At the end of Moses' life, there's this little eulogy here about him. And you would think that at the end of such a magnificent, marvelous, God-fearing life, the words would have been, Moses knew God so well. But actually here it's reversed. It says, God knew Moses face to face. That's what God wants from his people. A people who will love him with their heart, soul, might. People who respond to him, a people who, when he calls them forward into change, there is that yes and amen of faith in their hearts. He wants to know us. He knows he's the rock who can carry us securely through the reed baskets and the palaces and the backsides of the wilderness and the wandering and everything else. He knows he is the one who's best for us. He wants to know us. That's Moses' life. And maybe you could reflect on Moses' life. Yeah, he did all these things and then he died. And so even Moses himself, in his death, comes to an end. And you could even think, well, it's kind of unfair or unfortunate of God to not let Moses get into the land. Yeah, sure, there was some sin on the part of the people and Moses was impetuous, but really, I mean, a whole lifetime and just a couple little things that he messed up and he can't really get into the promised land. Like there's all these questions here that come up. But when you get over into the New Testament, there's this amazing scene where Jesus goes up to the top of a mountain. We don't know exactly which one it is, but it's in Mark chapter 9. And when he gets to the top of that mountain, Jesus is with Peter, James, and John, and it says that the glory of God is revealed from within Jesus. He's transfigured, and there appeared with him Elijah and Moses. What? Yeah, Moses in the promised land. It's a little bit later, But through the lens of eternity, God still fulfills the dream that Moses had in his heart to be in the promised land. We could look at this story from a very narrow perspective and think, it's kind of unfair for Moses. But Moses understood God, his rock, his eternal rock, so well that he's able to die in peace with words of blessing on his lips, knowing that God had his best in mind all along. Where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the choice. Do we trust the rock? Or do we waste our time wandering after all these other little rocks, thinking that they're the things that will sustain us through the constant change and challenge of life? That's what Deuteronomy's been driving at all along, calling us back to love the Lord your God, the one true God. And then Paul gives us this beautiful little insight in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 as he looks back and he's commenting on the life of the people wandering through the wilderness. He says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under this cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 looks back on that journey and says, in the midst of those people, God was their rock, providing, caring, faithful, just, loving, and the rock was Christ. And Jesus, he comes as the new and the greater, the true Moses, succeeds where we fail, has strength when ours lets out, bears suffering and punishment that we cannot bear ourselves, and then says to us, follow me, trust me. As we come to the close of the book of Deuteronomy together, the choice remains before us. Will we look to God, our rock? Will we trust Christ, the true rock, who died for us, rose again, and extends the promise of blessing in the promised land? Let's pray.